I'm an instructor at the Turing School of Software and Design, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the difference between front-end and back-end development and hopefully help you choose which path you want to embark on as you start your journey as a software developer. You may have encountered a term known as the stack, and this kind of can be broken down into back-end, front-end, and oftentimes you might even see this term full stack. As a new developer, you probably don't know all the difference between these, and that's okay. You might have been asking yourself, what do these things mean? Where does my code run? What technologies am I working in? At Turing specifically, we teach web development, and this means that we build applications that live on the internet. When we think about front-end development, we're writing code that lives on a user's computer. For the sake of web applications itself, this code will live within a user's web browser, such as Chrome, Firefox, Safari, maybe Netscape if you're super old school. But oftentimes, front-end development is referred to as client-side. A client is another term for a user's computer or machine. So since we're writing code that lives on a user's computer, that's why we refer to it as client-side. One interesting thing about front-end development is it's very user-facing and can be thought of as like the presentation layer. Not only is it user-facing, front-end development is very user-driven. It includes concepts such as data visualization, design principles, and figuring out how to manage tricky user interactions. This is a little bit different than back-end development. When we're thinking about back-end development, you're writing code that lives on a server somewhere. So compared to front-end, it's code that doesn't live on a user's client or a user's machine. This code oftentimes may not actually interact with the end user directly. Since this code lives on a server somewhere else, backend can also be referred to as server-side. It's often a backend's job to store and manipulate data that is eventually going to be sent to the front-end code or the presentation layer, whose job it is to, if we think back to front-end development, is to display that data in a way that allows a user to interact with it. Back-end development also oftentimes involves searching through data and presenting it to the front end. Now, as you're starting to probably piece together, front-end and back-end need to communicate together to make things happen in a web application. But how do they do that? Front-end and back-end technologies communicate via a protocol called HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. That's quite the mouthful, and includes a lot of technical terms that you're probably not familiar with, and that's okay. For today, all you need to know is that HTTP is the standard for how data is sent back and forth over the internet. So, to start actually thinking about like the difference between front end and back end, I recommend actually going into practice and trying to put it together for yourself as to what is happening on the front end and what is happening on the back end. Thinking about what is happening to the user, which would be front end or client side, and what data is being searched for or stored somewhere else on the server side or back end. I recommend you take a minute to pause this video and log on to Airbnb.com. I want you to actually go through and fill out a form for the location and dates and click submit. As you're doing this, ask yourself, what's happening on the front end, what's happening on the back end, and what order are these events happening? Take a minute to pause now, and I'll spend a few moments after walking through how the front end and back end communicate on Airbnb. Okay, let's take a look at Airbnb now. So as you can see, we are on the Airbnb site, and it actually has a really pleasant user experience. I'd say that there's very clear markers for me as to what I need to do, and very clear instructions. So let's focus on this form right now. So when I click on the location, as I do that, notice how more interactions are happening. More things are appearing on the screen. So let's say we want to go to Denver, Colorado. As I click that, notice how the view changed to move right away to the dates I want to check in. So let's say I'm planning a trip over the Valentine's Day weekend. We'll make it a long weekend, so I'm checking in on February 12th and February 15th, and notice how I didn't even need to enter that. As I'm clicking and interacting with this calendar, that's getting populated in this form above. So I'm going to add myself and my partner. Now, notice all the things that I've done have now been stored in this form. All of this, we could say right now, is happening on the front end. We have this data currently captured, but right now, nothing's actually happened. So I've added my guests. When I click search, this is where the magic starts to happen. Notice how my view changes again. And all of a sudden, we get all this data back on different places that I can visit in Denver. Think back to that form, which we can kind of see up at the top here. This data that we package together, where we're going, Denver, the dates, and how many guests get sent to our backend. The backend is going to search through its database to determine what data meets the criteria we provided. Once that data is found, it is going to be sent to our front end, which then displays that data. So we can imagine that the data that got sent from our back end to our front end probably includes a lot of these different things. So we probably have data on the images, the name of the place, where it's located, its price, what type it is. And as I scroll through, I can see more and more things, right? This is a very basic example of front end and back end connection that happens on every single web application or website. At the Turing School of Software and Design, if you come to our front end program, you'll focus mainly on building the user interactions and display and presentation logic for web applications and websites. If you come to our back end program, you're going to be primarily focused on building APIs and databases that store and serve the data that will eventually come to our front end. What's great about our program is that throughout the experience, you are going to get exposure to the full stack, which essentially means you'll get exposure to front end and back end web development regardless of which program you come to. You can't really make a wrong choice. It's always great to get exposure, and I recommend continuing to explore front end or back end development more to help you make the choice you want to come to our program. Thanks for taking the time to learn a little bit about the difference between front end and back end development. We look forward to seeing you at the Turing School of Software and Design.